Letters between Tolstoy and Gandhi. Westminster Place Hotel, 4 Victoria Street, London, SW, 1st October 1909. To Count Leo Tolstoy. Sir, I take the liberty of inviting your attention to what has been going on in the Transvaal of South Africa for nearly 3 years. There is in that colony a British Indian population of nearly 13,000. These Indians have for several years labored under various legal disabilities. The prejudice against color and in some respects Asiatics is intense in that colony. It is largely due, so far as Asiatics are concerned, to trade jealousy. The climax was reached 3 years ago with a law which I and many others considered to be degrading and calculated to unman those to whom it was applicable. I felt that submission to the law of this nature was inconsistent with the spirit of true religion. I and some of my friends were and still are firm believers in the doctrine of non-resistance to evil. I had the privilege of studying your writings also, which left a deep impression on my mind. British Indians, before whom the position was fully explained, accepted the advice that we should not submit to the legislation, but that we should suffer imprisonment or whatever other penalties the law may impose for its breach. The result has been that nearly one-half of the Indian population that was unable to stand the heat of the struggle, to suffer the hardships of imprisonment, have withdrawn from the Transvaal rather than submit to law which they considered degrading. Of the other half, nearly 2,500 have for conscience sake allowed themselves to be imprisoned, some as many as 5 times. The imprisonments have varied from 4 days to 6 months, in the majority of cases with hard labor. Many have been financially ruined. At present there are over 100 passive resistors in the Transvaal jails. Some of these have been very poor men, earning their living from day to day. The result has been that their wives and children have had to be supported out of public contributions, but also largely raised from passive resistors. This has put a severe strain upon British Indians, but in my opinion they have risen to the occasion. The struggle still continues, and one does not know when the end will come. This, however, some of us at least have seen most clearly, that passive resistance will and can succeed where brute force must fail. We also notice that insofar as the struggle has been prolonged, it has been due largely to our weakness, and hence to a belief having been engendered in the mind of the government that we would not be able to stand continued suffering. Together with a friend, I have come here to see the imperial authorities and to place before them the position with a view to seeking redress. Passive resistors have recognized that they should have nothing to do with pleading with the government, but the deputation has come at the instance of the weaker members of community, and it therefore represents their weakness rather than their strength. But in the course of my observation here, I have felt that if a general competition for an essay on the ethics and efficacy of passive resistance were invited, it would popularize the movement and make people think. A friend has raised the question of morality in connection with the proposed competition. He thinks that such an invitation would be inconsistent with the true spirit of passive resistance, and that it would amount to buying opinion. May I ask you to favor me with your opinion on the subject of morality? And if you consider that there is nothing wrong in inviting contributions, I would ask you also to give me the names of those whom I should specifically approach to write upon the subject. There is one thing more, with reference to which I would trespass upon your time. A copy of your letter addressed to a Hindu on the present unrest in India has been placed in my hands by a friend. On the face of it, it appears to represent your views. It is the intention of my friend, at his own expense, to have 20,000 copies printed and distributed, and to have it translated also. We have, however, not been able to secure the original, and we do not feel justified in printing it unless we are sure of the accuracy of the copy and of the fact that it is your letter. I venture to enclose herewithin a copy of the copy, and should esteem it a favor if you kindly let me know whether it is your letter, and whether it is an accurate copy, and whether you approve of its publication in the above manner. If you will add anything further to the letter, please do so. I would also venture to make a suggestion. In the concluding paragraph, you seem to dissuade the reader from a belief in reincarnation. I do not know whether, if it is not impertinent on my part to mention this, you have specifically studied the question. Reincarnation or transmigration is a cherished belief with millions in India, indeed in China also. With many, one might also say it is a matter of experience, no longer a matter of academic acceptance. It explains reasonably the many mysteries of life. With some of the passive resistors who have gone through the goals of Transvaal, it has been their solace. My object in writing this is not to convince you of the truth of the doctrine, but to ask you if you will please remove the word reincarnation from the other things you dissuade your readers from. In the letter in question, you have quoted largely from Krishna and given references to passage. I should thank you to give me the title of the book from which the quotations have been made. I have wearied you with this letter. I am aware that those who honor you and endeavor to follow you have no right to trespass upon your time. But it is rather their duty to refrain from giving you trouble as far as possible. I have, however, who am an utter stranger to you, taken the liberty of addressing this communication in the interests of truth and in order to have your advice on problems, the solution of which you have made your life work. With respects, I remain your obedient servant, M.K. Gandhi. Yasnaya Poliana, 7 October 1909, M.K. Gandhi, Transvaal. Just now I have received your very interesting letter, which gives me great pleasure. May God help all our dear brothers and co-workers in the Transvaal. This fight between gentleness and brutality, between humility and love on one side and conceit and violence on the other, makes itself ever more strongly felt here to us also, especially in the sharp conflicts between religious obligation and the laws of the state, expressed by the conscientious objections to render military service. Such objections are taking place very frequently. I have written a letter to a Hindu and am very pleased to have it translated into English. The title of the book on Krishna will be coming to you from Moscow. As regards rebirth, I, for my part, shall leave out nothing, for as it appears to me, the belief in a rebirth will never be able to strike such deep roots in and restrain mankind as the belief in the immortality of the soul and the faith in divine truth and love. Of course, I would accommodate you, if you so desire, to delete those passages of question. It will give me great pleasure to help your edition. Publication and circulation of my writings, translated into Indian dialects, can only be a matter of pleasure to me. The question regarding monetary payment of royalty should not at all be allowed to appear in religious undertakings. I give my fraternal greeting and am glad to come into personal contact with you. Leo Tolstoy. Westminster Place Hotel, 4 Victoria Street, London, W.C., 10/11/1909. Dear Sir, I beg to tender my thanks to your registered letter in connection with the letter addressed to a Hindu, and with the matters that I dealt with in my letter to you. Having heard about your failing health, I refrain, in order to save you the trouble from sending an acknowledgment, knowing that a written expression of my thanks is a superfluous formality. But Mr. Aylmer Maude, whom I have now been able to meet, reassured me that you are keeping good health indeed, and that unfailingly and regularly you attend to your correspondence every morning. It was a very gladsome news to me, and it encourages me to write to you further about matters which are, I know, of the greatest importance according to your teaching. I beg to send you herewith a copy of a book written by a friend, an Englishman, who is at present in South Africa, in connection with my life, insofar as it has a bearing on the struggle with which I am so connected and to which my life is dedicated. As I am very anxious to engage your active interest and sympathy, I thought it would not be considered by you as out of the way for me to send you the book. In my opinion, this struggle of the Indians in the Transvaal is the greatest of modern times. inasmuch as it has been idealized both as the goal as also to the methods adopted to reach the goal. I am not aware of a struggle in which participatories are not to derive any personal advantage at the end of it, and in which 50% of the persons affected have undergone great suffering and trial for the sake of a principle. It has not been possible for me to advertise this struggle as much as I should like. You command possibly the widest public today. If you are satisfied as to the facts, you will find set forth in Mr. Doke's book, D-O-K-E, in Mr. Doke's book, and if you consider that the conclusions I have arrived at are justified by the facts, may I ask you to use your influence in any manner you think fit to popularize the movement. If it succeeds, it will not only be a triumph of religion, love, and truth over irreligion, hatred, and falsehood, but it is highly likely to serve as an example to the millions in India and to people in other parts of the world who may be downtrodden and will certainly go a great way towards breaking up the party of violence, at least in India. If we hold out to the end, and I think we would, I entertain not the slightest doubt as to its ultimate success, and your encouragement in the way suggested to you can only strengthen us in our resolve. The negotiations that are going on for a settlement of the question have practically fallen through, and together with my colleagues, I return to South Africa this week and invite imprisonment. I may also add that my son has happily joined me in the struggle, and is now undergoing imprisonment with hard labor for 6 months. This is his 4th imprisonment in the course of the struggle. If you would be so good as to reply to this letter, may I ask you address your reply to me in Johannesburg, SA, Box 6522, hoping that this will find you in good health. I remain your obedient servant, M.K. Gandhi. Johannesburg, 4 April 1910. Dear Sir, as you may remember that I have written to you from London, where I stopped temporarily. As your devoted follower, I send you herewith a brief booklet which I have written. I have translated my own writings from Gujarati, my own language. What is remarkable is that my original book was confiscated by the government of India. Therefore, I was in a hurry to publish this translation. I am afraid I am burdening you, but if your health permits and you have time to go through my booklet, then I will need not express how greatly I shall value your criticism of it. I am sending also a few copies of your A Letter to a Hindu, which you allowed me to publish. This letter will also be translated into an Indian dialect. Yours respectfully, M.K. Gandhi. 8 May 1910. Dear friend, just now I have received your letter and your book, Indian Home Rule. I have read your book with great interest, because I think the question you have therein dealt with is important not only for Indians, but for the whole of mankind. I cannot find your first letter, but by discovering your biography by Doak, I happen to know you through that biography, which gripped me, and it gave me a chance to know and understand you better. I am not well at present, so I am unable to write to you on all the questions which are interconnected with your book, and also with your activities in general, which I value very much, but I shall write you as soon as I recover. Your friend and brother, Leo Tolstoy. 2124 Court Chambers, Johannesburg, 15 August 1910. M.K. Gandhi, Attorney, to Count Leo Tolstoy. Dear Sir, I am much obliged to you for your encouraging and cordial letter of the 8th May last. I very much value your general approval of my booklet, Indian Home Rule, and if you have the time, I shall look forward to your detailed criticism of the work, which you have been so good as to promise in your letter. Mr. Kallenbach has written to you about Tolstoy Farm. Mr. Kallenbach and I have been friends for many years. I may state that he has gone through most of the experiences, that you so graphically describe in your work, My Confession. No writing has so deeply touched Mr. Kallenbach as yours, and, as a spur to further effort in living up to the ideals held before the world by you, he has taken the liberty, after consultation with me, of naming his farm after you. Of his generous action in giving the use of the farm for passive resistors, the members of Indian opinion, I am sending herewith will give you full information. I should not have burdened you with these details but for the fact of your taking a personal interest in the passive resistance struggle that is going on in the Transvaal. I remain your faithful servant, M.K. Gandhi. 7 September 1910. Kochti, Kochti, 2. M.K. Gandhi, Johannesburg, Transvaal, South Africa. I have received your journal, Indian Opinion, and I am happy to know all that is written on non-resistance. I wish to communicate to you the thoughts which are aroused in me by the reading of those articles. The more I live, and especially now that I am approaching death, the more I feel inclined to express to others the feelings which so strongly move my being, and which, according to my opinion, are of great importance. That is, what one calls non-resistance is in reality nothing else but the discipline of love, undeformed by false interpretation. Love is the aspiration for communion and solidarity with other souls, and that aspiration always liberates the source of noble activities. That love is the supreme and unique law of human life which everyone feels in the depth of one's soul. We find it manifest most clearly in the soul of infants. Man feels it so long as he is not blinded by the false doctrines of the world. That law of love has been promulgated by all the philosophies, Indian, Chinese, Hebrew, Greek, and Roman. I think that it has been most clearly expressed by Christ, who said that in the law is contained both the law and the prophets. But he has done more, anticipating the deformation to which the law is exposed. He indicated directly the dangers of such deformation which is natural to people who live only for worldly interests. The danger consists precisely in permitting oneself to defend those interests by violence, that is to say, as he has expressed, returning blow by blows and taking back by force things that have been taken from us, and so forth. Christ knew also, just as all reasonable human beings must know, that the employment of violence is incompatible with love, which is the fundamental law of life. He knew that once violence is admitted, it doesn't matter even in a single case, the law of love is thereby rendered futile. That is to say that the law of love ceases to exist. The whole Christian civilization, so brilliant in the exterior, has grown up on this misunderstanding and this flagrant and strange contradiction, sometimes conscious but mostly unconscious. In reality, as soon as resistance is admitted by the side of love, love no longer exists and cannot exist as the law of existence. And if the law of love cannot exist, there remains no other law except that of violence, that is, the right of the mighty. It was thus that the Christian society has lived during these 19 centuries. It is a fact that all the time people who were following not only violence in the organization of society, but the difference between the ideals of Christian people and that of other nations lies only in this, that in Christianity the law of love has been expressed so clearly and definitely as has never been expressed in any other religious doctrine, that the Christian world has been solemnly accepted by the law, although at the same time it has been permitted the employment of violence, and on that violence it has constructed their whole life. Consequently, the life of the Christian peoples is an absolute contradiction between their profession and the basis of their life, contradiction between love, recognized as the law of life, and violence, recognized as inevitable in different departments of life, like government, tribunals, army, etc., which are recognized and praised. That contradiction development with the inner development of the Christian world and has attained its paroxysm in recent days. At present, the question poses itself evidently in the following manner. Either it must be admitted that we do not recognize any discipline, religious or moral, or that we are guided in the organization of life only by the law of force, or that all the taxes that we exact by force, the judicial and police organizations, and above all, the army, must be abolished. This spring, in the religious examination of a secondary school for girls in Moscow, the professor of catechism, as well as the bishop, had questioned the young girls on the 10 Commandments, and above all the sixth, "Thou shalt not kill." When the examiner received a good reply, the bishop generally paused for another question. Is killing prescribed by the sacred law always and in all cases? And the poor girls, perverted by their teacher, must reply, "No, not always. Killing is permitted during war and for the execution of criminals." However, one of these unfortunate girls, which I relate, is not a fiction, but a fact that has been transmitted to me by an eyewitness, having been asked the same question, "Is killing always a crime?" was moved deeply, blushed, and replied with decision, "Yes, always." To all the sophisticated questions habitual to the bishop, she replied with firm conviction. Killing is always forbidden in the Old Testament as well as by Christ, who not only forbids killing, but all wickedness against our neighbors. In spite of all his oracle talent and all his imposing grandeur, the bishop was obliged to beat a retreat, and the young girl came out victorious. Yes, we can discuss in our journals the progress in aviation and such other discoveries, the complicated diplomatic relations, the different clubs and alliances, the so-called artistic creations, etc., and pass in silence that which was affirmed by the young girl. But silence is futile in such cases, because every one of this Christian world is feeling the same, more or less vaguely, like that girl. Socialism, communism, anarchism, Salvation Army, the growing criminalities, unemployment, and absurd luxuries of the rich, augmented without limit, and the awful misery of the poor, the terribly increasing number of suicides, all of these are signs of that inner contradiction which must be there and which cannot be resolved, and without doubt can only be resolved by acceptance of the law of love and by the rejection of all sorts of violence. Consequently, your work in Transvaal, which seems to be far away from the center of the world, is yet the most fundamental and most important to us, supplying the most weighty practical proof in which the world can now share and with which we must participate, not only the Christians, but all the peoples of the world. I think that it would give you pleasure to know that with us in Russia, a similar movement is also developing rapidly under the form of the refusal of military service, augmenting year after year. However small may be the number of your participators in non-resistance and the number of those in Russia who refuse military service, both the one and the other may assert with audacity, God is with us, and that God is more powerful than men. Between the confession of Christianity, even under the perverted form in which it appears amongst us Christian peoples, and the simultaneous recognition of the necessity of armies and of the preparation for killing in an ever-increasing scale, there exists a contradiction so fragrant and prying that sooner or later, probably very soon, it must inevitably manifest itself in utter nakedness, and it will lead us either to renounce the Christian religion and to maintain the governmental power, or to renounce the existence of the army and all the forms of violence which the state supports and which are more or less necessary to sustain power. That contradiction is felt by all the governments, as well as by our Russian government, and therefore by the spirit of conservation nationalism to these governments. The opposition is persecuted, as we find in Russia as well as in the articles of your journal, which more than any other is persecuted more than any other anti-governmental activity. The governments know from which direction comes the principal danger and try to defend themselves with a great zeal in that trial, not merely to preserve their interests, but actually to fight for their very existence. With my perfect esteem, Leo Tolstoy. Tolstoy died 2.5 months later, on November 20th, 1910, and Gandhi returned to India 5 years later, in 1915. Obituary of Leo Tolstoy, in India Opinion, November 26, 1910. Of the late Count Leo Tolstoy we can only write with reverence. He was to us more than one of the greatest men of his age. We have endeavored, so far as possible, and so far as we understood it, to follow his teachings. The end of his bodily life has been but the final touch to the work of humanity that he, in his own inimitable manner, inaugurated. Tolstoy is not dead. He lives through the lives of his innumerable followers throughout the world. We firmly believe that, as time rolls on, his teachings will more and more permeate mankind. Though a devout Christian, he truly interpreted not only Christianity, but he likewise gave a realistic presentation on the substance underlying the great world religions. And he has shown, as no other teacher, at any rate in Europe, has shown how present-day civilization, based as it is on brute force, is a negation of the divinity in humans, and how, before a person can realize themselves, they must substitute brute force by love in all their actions. In the daily walk of life, perhaps his letter to Mr. Gandhi, which we produced on the first page, was one of the last, if not the last, writings from his pen. In it he almost foreshadowed his dissolution, and it must be a matter of great encouragement and melancholy satisfaction to Indian passive resistors that the sage of Yasnaya Polyana considered the Transvaal struggle to be one of worldwide importance. Readers note the last sentence in the first paragraph about realizing love by all actions was degendered. A letter to a Hindu, The Subjugation of India, Its Cause and Cure, with an introduction by M.K. Gandhi. Introduction. The letter printed below is a translation of Tolstoy's letter, written in Russian, and in reply to one from the editor of Free Hindustan. After having passed from hand to hand, this letter at the last came into my possession, through a friend who asked me, as one much interested in Tolstoy's writing, whether I thought it worth publishing. I at once replied in the affirmative, and told him I should translate it myself into Gujarati, and introduce others to translate and publish it in various Indian vernaculars. The letter as received by me was a typewritten copy. It was therefore referred to the author, who confirmed it as his, and kindly granted me permission to print it. To me, as a humble follower of that great teacher whom I have long looked upon as one of my guides, it is a matter of honor to be connected with the publication of his letter, such especially as the one which is now being given to the world. It is a mere statement of fact to say that every Indian, whether he owns up to it or not, has national aspirations. But there are as many opinions as there are Indian nationalists as to the exact meaning of that aspiration, and most especially as to the methods to be used to attain the end. One of the accepted and time-honored methods to attain the end is that of violence. The assassination of Sir Curzon Wyllie was an illustration of that method in its worst and most detestable form. Tolstoy's life has been devoted to replacing the method of violence for removing tyranny or securing reform by the method of non-resistance to evil. He would meet hatred expressed in violence by love expressed in self-suffering. He admits of no exception to whittle down this great and divine law of love. He applies it to all the problems that trouble mankind. When a man like Tolstoy, one of the clearest thinkers in the Western world, one of the greatest writers, one who was a soldier, has also known that violence is and what violence can do, condemns Japan for having blindly followed the law of modern science, falsely so called, the fears of that country, the great calamities, it is for us to pause and consider whether, in our impatience of English rule, we do not want to replace one evil by another and a worse. India, which is the nursery of great faiths of the world, will cease to be nationalist India, whatever else she may become, when she goes through the process of civilization in the shape of reproduction on that sacred soil of gun factories, and that hateful industrialization which has reduced the people of Europe to a state of slavery, and all but stifled among them the best instincts which are the heritage of the human family. If we do not want the English in India, we must pay the price. Tolstoy indicated it, quote, "Do not resist evil, but also do not yourselves participate in evil, in the violent deeds of the administration of the laws of court, the collection of taxes, and, what is most important, of the soldiers, and no one in the world will enslave you." Passionate declared, quote, unquote, passionately declares the sage of Yasnaya Polyana. Who can question the truth of what he is saying in the following, quote, "A commercial company enslaved a nation by compromising 200 millions. Tell this to a man free from superstition, and he will fail to grasp what these words mean. What does it mean that 30,000 people, not athletes, but rather weak and ordinary people, have enslaved 200 millions of vigorous, clever, capable, freedom-loving people? Do not the figures make it clear that not the English, but the Indians have enslaved themselves?" Unquote. One need not accept all that Tolstoy says, some of his facts are not accurately stated, to realize the central truth of his indictment of the present system, which is to understand and act upon the irresistible power of the soul over the body, of love, which is attributed of the soul over the over the brute or body force generated by the stirring up in us of evil passions. There is no doubt that there is something new in what Tolstoy preaches, but his presentation of the old truth is refreshingly forceful, his logic unassailable, and above all he endeavors to practice what he preaches. He preaches to convince, he is sincere, and he is earnest, he commands attention. Johannesburg, 19th November, 1909, M.K. Gandhi. A Letter to a Hindu by Leo Tolstoy. All that exists is one. People only call this one by different names, the Vedas. God is love, and he that abideth in love abideth in God, and God abideth in him. 1 John 4:16. God is one whole, and we are the parts. Exposition of the teaching of the Vedas by Vivekananda. 1. Do not seek quiet and rest in those earthly realms where delusions and desires are engendered, for if thou dost, thou wilt be dragged through the rough wilderness of life, which is far from thee. Wherever thou feelest that thy feet are becoming entangled in the interlaced roots of life, know that thou hast strayed from the path to which I beckon thee. For I have placed thee in broad, smooth paths, which are strewn with flowers, and I have put a light before thee, which thou canst follow, and thus run without stumbling. Krishna. I have received your letter and 2 numbers on your periodical, both of which interest me extremely. The oppression of a majority by a minority, the demoralization inevitably resulting from it, is a phenomenon which has always occupied me, and has done so more particularly of late. I will try to explain to you what I think about that subject in general, and particularly about the cause from which the dreadful evils of which you write in your letter, and in the Hindu periodical you have sent me, have arisen and continue to arise. The reason for that astonishing fact that a majority of working people submit to a handful of idlers who control their labor and their very lives is always and everywhere the same, whether the oppressors and the oppressed are of one race, or whether, as in India and elsewhere, the oppressors are of a different nation. This phenomenon seems particularly strange in India, for there more than 200 million people, highly gifted both physically and mentally, find themselves in the power of a small group of people, quite alien to them in thought and immeasurably inferior to them in religious morality. From your letter and the articles in Free Hindustan, as well as from the very interesting writings of the Hindu Swami Vivekananda and others, it appears that, as in the case in our time with the ills of all nations, the reason lies in the lack of a reasonable religious teachings which, by explaining the meaning of life, would supply a supreme law for the guidance of conduct and would replace the more than dubious precepts of pseudo-religion and pseudo-science with the immoral conclusion deduced from them and commonly called, quote, civilization. Your letter, as well as the articles in Free Hindustan and the Indian political literature generally, show that most of the leaders of public opinion among your people no longer attach any significance to the religious teachings that were and are professed by the people of India, and recognize no possibility of freeing the people from the oppression they endure except by adopting the irreligious and profoundly immoral social arrangements under which the English and other pseudo-Christian nations live today. And yet, the chief, if not sole cause of the enslavement by the Indian peoples by the English lies in the very absence of a religious consciousness and of guidance for conducts which should flow from it, a lack common in our day to all nations, East and West, from Japan to England and America alike. 2. O ye who see perplexities over your heads, beneath your feet, and to the right and to the left of you, you will be an eternal enigma unto yourselves until ye become humble and joyful as children. Then will ye find me, and having found me in yourselves, you will rule over the worlds. And looking out from the great world within to the little world without, you will bless everything that is, and find all is well with time and with you. Krishna. To make my thoughts clear to you, I must go further back. We do not, cannot, and I venture to say need not, know how men lived 1,000,000 years ago, even 10,000 years ago. But we do know positively that, as far back as we have any knowledge of mankind, it has always lived in special groups of families, tribes, and nations, in which the majority, in the conviction that it must be so, submissively and willingly bowed to the rule of one or more persons, that is to say, a very small minority. Despite all varieties of circumstances and personalities, these relations manifested themselves among the various people of whose origin we have any knowledge, and the further back we go, the more absolutely necessary did this arrangement appear, both to the ruler and the ruled, to make it possible for people to live peacefully together. So it was everywhere, but through the external form of life. So it was everywhere. But though this external form of life existed for centuries and still exists, very early, thousands of years before our time, amid this life based on coercion, one and the same thought constantly emerged among different nations, namely, that in every individual a spiritual element is manifested that gives life to all that exists, and that this spiritual element strives to unite with everything of a like nature to itself, and attains this aim through love. This thought appeared in most various forms at different times and places, with varying completeness and clarity. It found expression in Brahmanism, Judaism, Mazdaism, the teachings of Zoroaster, in Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and in the writings of Greek and Roman sages, as well as in Christianity and Mohammedanism. The mere fact that this thought has sprung up among different nations and at different times indicates that it is inherent in human nature and contains the truth. But this truth was made known to people who considered that a community could only be kept together if some of them restrained others, and so it appeared quite irreconcilable with the existing order of society. Moreover, it was first expressed only fragmentarily, and so obscurely that though people admitted its theoretic truth, they could not entirely accept it as guidance for their conduct. Then, too, the dissemination of the truth in a society based on coercion was always hindered in one and in the same manner, namely, those in power, feeling that the recognition of this truth would undermine the position, consciously or sometimes unconsciously, perverted it by explanations and additions quite foreign to it, and also opposed it by open violence. Thus, the truth that his life should be directed by the spiritual element which is its basis, which manifests itself as love, and which is so natural to man. This truth, in order to force a way into man's consciousness, had to struggle not merely against the obscurity with which it was expressed and the intentional and unintentional distortions surrounding it, but also against deliberate violence, which by means of persecutions and punishments sought to compel men to accept religious laws authorized by the rulers and conflicting with the truth. Such a hindrance and misrepresentation of the truth, which had yet achieved complete clarity, occurred everywhere, in Confucianism, in Taoism, in Buddhism, in Christianity, in Mohammedanism, and in Brahmanism. 3. My hand has sowed love everywhere, giving unto all that will receive. Blessings are offered unto all my children, but many times in their blindness they fail to see them. How few there are who gather the gifts which lie in profusion at their feet. How many there are who, in wilful waywardness, turn their eyes away from them and complain with a wail that they have not that which I have given them. Many of them defiantly repudiated by not only my gifts, but me also, me, the source of all blessings and the author of their blessings, Krishna. I tarry a while from the turmoil and strife of the world. I will beautify and quicken thy life with love and with joy. For the light of the soul is love. Where love is, there is contentment and peace. And where there is contentment and peace, there I also am in their midst. Krishna. The aim of the sinless one consists in acting without causing sorrow to others, though he could attain to great power by ignoring their feelings. The aim of the sinless one lies in not doing evil unto those who have done evil unto him. If a man causes suffering even to those who hate him without any reason, he will ultimately have grief not only to be overcome. He will ultimately have grief not to be overcome. The punishment of evildoers consists in making them feel ashamed of themselves by doing them a great kindness. Of what use is superior knowledge in the one if he does not endeavor to relieve his neighbor's wants as much as his own? If in the morning a man wishes to do evil unto another, in the evening the evil will return to him. The Hindu Kurdal. Now, Leo Tolstoy. Thus it went on everywhere. The recognition that love represents the highest morality was nowhere denied or contradicted, but this truth was so inevitably everywhere, with all kinds of falsehoods which distorted it, that finally nothing of it remained but words. It was taught that this highest morality was only applicable to private life, for home use, as it were, but that in public life all forms of violence, such as imprisonment, execution, wars, might be used for the protection of the majority against the minority of evildoers. Though such means were diametrically opposed to any vestige of love, and though common sense indicated that if some men claim to decide who is to be subjected to violence of all kinds for the benefit of others, these men to whom violence is applied may, in turn, arrive at a similar conclusion with regard to those who have employed violence to them, and though the great religious teachers of Brahmanism, Buddhism, and above all Christianity, foreseeing such a perversion of the law of love, have constantly drawn attention to the one invariable condition of love, namely the enduring of injuries, insults, and violence of all kinds, without resisting evil by evil. People continued, regardless of all that leads man forward, to try to unite the incompatibles, the virtue of love, and what is opposed to love, namely the resisting of evil by violence. And such a teaching, despite its inner contradiction, was so firmly established that the very people who recognize love as a virtue accept as lawful at the same time the order of life based on violence, and allowing men not merely to torture, but even to kill one another. For a long time, people tried in this obvious contradiction without noticing it, but a time arrived when this contradiction became more and more evident to thinkers of various nations, and the old and simple truth that it is natural for man to help and to love one another, but not to torture and to kill one another, became ever clearer, so that fewer and fewer people were able to believe the sophistries by which the distortion of the truth has been made so plausible. In former times, the chief method of justifying the use of violence, and thereby infringing the law of love, was by claiming a divine right for the rulers, the czars, sultans, rajas, shahs, and other heads of state. But the longer humanity lived, the weaker grew the belief in this peculiar God-given right of the ruler. That belief withered in the same way and almost simultaneously in the Christian and Brahmin world, as well as in Buddhist and Confucian spheres, and in recent times it has so faded away as to prevail no longer against man's reasonable understanding and the true religious feeling. People saw more and more clearly, and now the majority see quite clearly, the senseless immorality of subordinating their wills to those of other people just like themselves, when they are bidden to do what is contrary not only to their interests but also to their moral sense. And so one might suppose that having lost confidence in any religious authority for a belief in the divinity of potentates of various kinds, people would try to free themselves from the subjugation of it. But unfortunately, not only were the rulers, who were considered supernatural beings, benefited by having the peoples in subjugation, but as a result of the belief in and during the rule of those pseudo-divine beings, ever larger and larger circles of people grouped and established themselves around them, and under an appearance of governing, took advantage of the people. And when the old deception of supernatural and God-appointed authority had dwindled away, these men were not only concerned to devise a new one, which, like its predecessor, should make it possible to hold people in bondage to a limited number of rulers. Part 4. True quotes. Children, do you want to know by what your hearts should be guided? Throw aside your longings and strivings after that which is null and void. Get rid of your erroneous thoughts about happiness and wisdom, and your empty and insincere desires. Dispense with these, and you will know love. Krishna. Be not the destroyers of yourself. Arise to your true being, and you will have nothing to fear. Krishna. Now Tolstoy. New justifications have now appeared in the place of antiquated, obsolete religious ones. These new justifications are just as inadequate as the old ones, but as they are new, their futility cannot immediately be recognized by the majority of men. Besides this, those who now enjoy power propagate these new sophistries and support them so skillfully that they seem irrefutable, even to many of those who suffer from the oppression these theories seek to justify. These new justifications are termed scientific, but by the scientific is understood just what was formerly understood by the term religious, just as formerly everything called religious was held to be unquestionable simply because it was called religious. So now all that is called scientific is held to be unquestionable. In the present case, the obsolete religious justification of violence, which consisted in the recognition of the supernatural personality of the God-ordained rule, quote, there is no power but of God, unquote, has been superseded by the quote, scientific justification, which puts forward first the assertion that because the coercion of man by man has existed in all ages, it follows that such coercion must continue to exist. This assertion that people should continue to live as they have done throughout past ages, rather than as their reason and conscience indicate, is what science, quote unquote, calls quote, the historic law, unquote. Further, quote, scientific justification lies in the statement that as among plants and wild beasts there is a constant struggle for existence which always results in the survival of the fittest. A similar struggle should be carried on among human beings, beings, that is, who are gifted with the intelligence and love, faculties lacking in creatures subject to the struggle for existence and survival of the fittest. Such is the second, quote, scientific justification. The third, most important, and unfortunately most widespread justification is, at bottom, the age-old religious one, just as a little altered. That in public life the suppression of some for the protection of the majority cannot be avoided, so that coercion is unavoidable, however desirable reliance on love alone might be in human intercourse. The only difference in this justification by pseudoscience consists in the fact that, to the question why such and such people, and not others, have the right to decide against whom violence may and must be used, pseudoscience now gives a different reply to that given by religion, which declared that the right to decide was valid because it was pronounced by persons possessed of divine power. Science says that these decisions represent the will of the people, which under a constitutional form of government is supposed to find expression in all the decisions and actions of those who are at the helm at the moment. Such are the scientific justifications of the principle of coercion. They are not merely weak, but absolutely invalid, yet they are so much needed by those who occupy privileged positions that they believe in them blindly, as they formerly believed in the Immaculate Conception, and propagate them just as confidently. And the unfortunate majority of men bound to toil is so dazzled by the pomp with which these, quote, scientific truths are presented, that under this new influence it accepts those scientific stupidities for holy truth, just as it formerly accepted the pseudo-religious justifications, and it continues to submit to the present holders of power, who are just as hard-hearted, but rather more numerous than before. Part 5, one quote. Who am I? I am that which thou hast searched for since thy baby eyes blazed wonderingly upon the world, whose horizons hide this real life from thee. I am that which in thy heart thou hast prayest for, demanded as thy birthright, although thou hast not known what it was. I am that which has lain in thy soul for hundreds and thousands of years. Sometimes I lay in thee grieving because thou dost not recognize me. Sometimes I raise my head, open my eyes, and extend my arms, calling thee either tenderly and quietly or strenuously, demanding that thou shouldst rebel against the iron chains which bound thee to this earth. Christmas. Not Tolstoy. So matters went on and still go on in the Christian world. But we might have hoped that in the immediate Brahmin, Buddhist, and Confucian worlds, this new scientific superstition would not establish itself, and that the Chinese, Japanese, and Hindus, once their eyes were opened to the religious fraud justifying violence, would advance directly to the recognition of the law of love inherent in humanity, and which has been so forcibly enunciated by the great Eastern teachers. But what has happened in the scientific superstition replacing the religious one has been accepted and secured a stronger and stronger hold in the East. In your periodical, you set out as the basic principle which should guide the actions of your people the maxim that, quote, resistance to aggression is not simply justifiable but imperative. Non-resistance hurts both altruism and egotism, unquote. Love is the only way to rescue humanity from all ills, and in it you too have the only method of saving your people from enslavement. In very ancient times, love was proclaimed with special strength and clearness among your people to be the religious basis of human life. Love and forcible resistance to evildoers involve such a mutual contradiction as to destroy utterly the whole sense and meaning of the conception of love. And what follows? With a light heart, and in the 20th century, you, an adherent of a religious peoples, deny their law, feelings convicted of your scientific enlightenment and your right to do so, and to repeat, do not take this amiss, the amazingly stupidity indoctrinated in you by the advocates of the use of violence, the enemies of truth, the servants first of theology and then of science, your European teachers. You say that the English have enslaved your people and hold them in subjugation, because the latter have not resisted resolutely enough, and have not met there by force. But the case is just the opposite. If the English have enslaved the people of India, it is just because the latter recognize, and still recognize, force as the fundamental principle of the social order. In accord with that principle, they submitted to their equal Harajas, and on their belief struggled against one another, fought the Europeans, the English, and now are trying to fight with them again. A commercial company enslaved a nation comprising 200 millions. To this, to a man free from superstition, and he will fail to grasp what these words mean. What does it mean that 30,000 men, not athletes, but rather weak and ordinary people, have subdued 200 million vigorous, clever, capable, and freedom-loving people? Do not the figures make it clear that it is not the English who have enslaved the Indians, but the Indians who have enslaved themselves? When the Indians complain that the English have enslaved them, it is as if drunkards complain that the spirit dwellers, who have settled among them, have enslaved them. You tell them that they might give up drinking, but they reply that they are so accustomed to it that they cannot abstain, and that they must have alcohol to keep up their energy. Is it not the same thing with the millions of people who submit to thousands or even hundreds of others, of their own and other nations? If the people of India are enslaved by violence, it is only because they themselves live and have lived by violence, and do not recognize the eternal law of love inherent in humanity. Here a quote by Krishna: "Pitiful and foolish is the man who seeks what he already has, and does not know that he has it. Yes, pitiful and foolish is he who does not know the bliss of love which surrounds him and which I have given him." Krishna. As soon as men live entirely in accord with the law of love, natural to their hearts and now revealed to them, which excludes all resistance by violence, and therefore held aloof from all participation of violence, as soon as this happens, not only will hundreds be able to enslave millions, but not even millions will be able to enslave a single individual. Do not resist the evildoer, and take no part in doing so, either in the violent deeds of the administration, in the law courts, the collection of taxes, or above all in soldiering, and no one in the world will be able to enslave you. Part 6. Quote by Krishna. O ye who sit in bondage and continually seek and pant for freedom, seek only love. Love is peace in itself, and peace which gives complete satisfaction. I am the key that opens the portal to the rarely discovered land, where contentment alone is found. Contentment. Krishna. What is now happening to the people of the East and of the West is like what happens to every individual when he passes from childhood to adolescence, and from youth into manhood. He loses what had hitherto guided his life, and lives without direction, not having found a new standard suitable to his age. And so he invents all sorts of occupations, cares, distractions, and stupefacions to divert his attention from the misery and senselessness of his life. Such a condition may last a long time. When an individual passes from one period of life to another, the time comes when he cannot go on in senseless activity and excitement as before, but has to understand that although he has outgrown what before used to direct him, this does not mean that he must live without any reasonable guidance, but rather that he must formulate for himself an understanding of life corresponding to his age, and having elucidated it must be guided by it. And in the same way, a similar time must come in the growth and development of humanity. I believe that such a time has now arrived, not in the sense that it has come in the year 1908, but that the inherent contradiction of life has now reached an extreme degree of tension, On the one side, there is the consciousness of the beneficence of the law of love, and on the other, the existing order of life, which has for centuries occasioned an, quote, empty, anxious, restless, and troubled mode of life, conflicting as it does with the law of love and built on the use of violence. This contradiction must be faced, and the solution will evidently not be favorable to the outlived law of violence, but to the truth which has dwelt in the hearts of men for remote antiquity, the truth that the law of love is in the accord with the nature of man. But man can only recognize this truth to its full extent when they have completely freed themselves from all religious and scientific superstitions and from all the consequent misinterpretations and sophistical distortions by which its recognitions have been hindered for centuries. To save a sinking ship, it is necessary to throw overboard the ballast, which, though it may once have been needed, would not cause the ship to sink. And so it is with the scientific superstition that hides the truth of their welfare from mankind. In order that men should embrace the truth, not in the vague way they did in childhood, nor in the one-sided and perverted way presented to them by their religious and scientific teachers, but embrace it as their highest law, the complete liberation of this truth from all and every superstition, both pseudo-religious and pseudo-scientific, by which it is still obscured is essential, not a partial, timid attempt reckoning with traditions sanctified by age and with the habits of the people, not such as was effected in the religious sphere by Guru Nanak, the founder of the sect of the Sikhs, and in the Christian world by Luther, and by similar reformers in other religions, but a fundamental cleansing of religious consciousness from all ancient traditions and modern scientific superstitions. If only people freed themselves from their beliefs in all kinds of Ormuts, Brahmas, Sabotas, and their incarnation as Krishna and Christs, from beliefs in paradises and hells, in reincarnations and resurrections, from belief in the interference of the gods in the external affairs of the universe, and above all, if they freed themselves from belief in the infallibility of the various Vedas, Bibles, Gospels, Tripitakas, Korans, and the like, and also freed themselves from blind belief in the variety of scientific teachings about infinitely small atoms and molecules in all the infinitely great and infinitely remote worlds, their movements and origin, as well as from faith in the infallibility of the scientific law to which humanity is at present subjected, the historic law, the economic law, the law of struggle and survival, and so on. If only people freed themselves from these terrible accumulations of futile exercises in our lower capacities of mind and memory, called the sciences, and from the innumerable divisions of all sorts of histories, anthropologies, homiletics, bacteriologies, jurisprudences, cosmographies, strategies. Their name is legion, and freed themselves from all this harmful, stupefying ballast, the simple law of love, natural to man, accessible to all, and solving all questions and perplexities, would itself be clear and obligatory. Part 7. Quote, 2 quotes. Children, look at the flowers at your feet. Do not trample upon them. Look at the love in your midst, and do not repudiate it. Krishna. There is a higher reason which transcends all human minds. It is far and near. It permeates all the worlds, and at the same time is infinitely higher than they. A man who sees that all things are contained in the higher spirit cannot treat any being with contempt. For him to whom all spiritual beings are equal to the highest, there can be no room for deception or grief. Those who are ignorant and are devoted to the religious rites are only in a deep gloom, but those who are given up to fruitless meditations are still in great darkness. The Upanishads from the Vedas. Now, Leo Tolstoy. Yes, in our time, all these things must be cleared away in order that mankind may escape from self-inflicted calamities that have reached an extreme intensity. Whether an Indian seeks liberation from subjugation to the English, or anyone else struggles with an oppressor, equal of his own nationality or of another, whether it be a Negro defending himself against the North Americans, or Persians, or Russians, or Turks against the Persians, the Russian or Turkish government, or any man seeking the greatest welfare for himself and for everybody else, they do not need explanations or justifications of old religious superstitions, such as have been formulated by your Vivekanandas, Baba Barahatis, and others, or in the Christian world by a number of similar interpreters and exponents of things that nobody needs, nor the innumerable scientific theories about matters not only unnecessary but for the most part harmful. In the spiritual realm, nothing is indifferent. What is not useful is harmful. What are wanted for the Indian, as for the Englishman, the Frenchman, and the German, and the Russian, are not constitutions and revolutions, nor all sorts of conferences and congresses, nor the many ingenious devices for submarine navigation and aerial navigation, nor all sorts of conveniences to add to the enjoyment of the rich ruling classes, nor new schools and universities with innumerable faculties of science, nor an augmentation of papers and books, nor gramophones and cinematographs, nor those childish and for the most part corrupt stupidities termed art. But one thing only is needful, the knowledge of the simple and clear truth which finds place in every soul that is not stupefied by religious and scientific superstitions. The truth that for our life one law is valid, the law of love, which brings the highest happiness to every individual, as well as to all mankind. Free your minds from these overgrown mountainous imbecilities which hinder your recognition of it, and at once the truth will emerge from amid the pseudo-religious nonsense that has been smothering in it. The indubitable eternal truth inherent in man, which is one and the same in all the great religions of the world. It will, in due time, emerge and make its way to general recognition, and the nonsense which has obscured it will disappear of itself, and with it will go the evil from which humanity now suffers. And we end with a quote by Krishna. Children, look upwards with your beclouded eyes, and a world full of joy and love will disclose itself to you, a rational world, made by my wisdom, the only real world. Then you will know what love has done with you, what love has bestowed upon you, what love demands from you. This was written in Yasnaya Polyana, December 14th, 1908. Tolstoy Farm. Mahatma Gandhi established Tolstoy Farm in 1910, both as a tribute to Leo Tolstoy and as a practical way of practicing the ideals set forth in Tolstoy's philosophy. The members of this commune, known as the Satyagrathis, nonviolent resistors, lived on an 1,100-acre self-sufficient farm. They devoted their bodies to the discipline of hard manual labor and devoted their minds to the ideals of truth, love, non-possession, non-violence, and chastity. Many different religious faiths were honored and practiced by the Satyagrahisis. After Gandhi returned to India, he perfected and expounded the Swadeshi, the principle of using goods which are made in one's own country. Movement, the Swadeshi movement, which had its foundation in the Tolstoy farm experience. Between 1919 and 1948, Gandhi wrote on the beauties of the village-oriented society. The spinning wheel became a popular Swadeshi symbol throughout India. Tolstoy Farm, A, by M.K. Gandhi. Upon the farm, oranges, apricots, and plums grew in such abundance that during the season, the Satyagrahis could have their fill of the fruit and yet have a surplus besides. The spring was about 500 yards away from our quarters, and the water had to be fetched on carrying poles. Here we insisted that we should not have any servants, but only for the household work but as far as may be even for farming and building operations. Everything, therefore, from cooking to scavenging was done by our own hands. As regards accommodating families, we resolved from the first that the men and women should be housed separately. The houses, therefore, were to be built in two separate blocks, each at some distance from another. For the time it was considered sufficient to provide accommodation for 10 women and 60 men. Then again we had to erect a house for Mr. Kallenbach, and by its side a schoolhouse, as well as a workshop for carpentry and shoemaking, etc. The settlers hailed from Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, and North India, and they were Hindus, Muslims, Parsis, and Christians among them. About 40 of them were young men, 2 or 3 old men, 5 women, and 20 to 30 children, of whom 4 or 5 were girls. The Christian and other women were meat eaters. Mr. Kallenbach and I thought it desirable to exclude meat from the farm, but how could we ask people who had no surplus in the matter? How could we ask people who had no scruples in the matter, who had been habituated to taking meat since childhood, and were coming over here in their days of adversary to give up meat even temporarily? If they were to give up meat, would not the swell our cost of living? Again, should those who had used to take beef be given that too? How many separate kitchens must be run in the case? What was my duty on this point? Having been instrumental in giving monetary help to these families, I had already accorded support to meat eating as well as beef eating. If I made a rule that meat eaters should not be helped, I would have to prosecute the Satyagraha struggle through vegetarianism only, which was absurd as the movement had been organized on behalf of all classes of Indians. I did not take long clearly to visualize my duty in these circumstances. If the Christians and the Muslims asked for even beef, that too must be provided for them. To refuse them admission to the farm was absolutely out of the question. But where love is, there God is also. The Mussulman friends had already granted me permission to have a purely vegetarian kitchen. I now had to approach Christian sisters whose husbands or sons were in jail. I had often come in such intimate contact with the Christian friends who were now in jail and who had on like occasions consented to having a vegetarian diet. But this was the first time I had to deal at close quarters with their families in their absence. I represented to the sisters the difficulty of housing accommodation as well as finance and my own deep-rooted sentiment in the matter. At the same time, I assured them even beef would be provided for them if they wanted. The sisters kindly consented not to have meat, and the cooking department was placed in their charge. I, with or without another man, was detailed to assist them. My presence acted as a check upon petty bickerings. The food was to be the simplest possible. The time as well as the number of meals was fixed up. There was not to be one single kitchen, but all were to dine in a single. There was to be one single kitchen, and all were to dine in a single row. Everyone was to see the cleaning of his own dish and other things. The common pots were to be cleaned by different parties in turn. I must state that the Satyagrahis lived on Tolstoy farm for a long time, but neither the women nor the men ever asked for meat. Drink, smoking, etc. were of course totally prohibited. As I have already stated, we wanted to be self-reliant as far as possible, even in erecting buildings. Our architect was Mr. Kallenbach, of course, and he got hold of a European mason, a Gujarati carpenter, Narayanbras Damania, volunteered his services free of charge and brought our other carpenters to work at reduced rates. As regards unskilled labor, the settlers of us who had supple limbs literally worked wonders. The first Satyagrahi, of the name of Vihari, did half of the carpenter's work. The lion-like Dambo Naidu was in charge of sanitation and marketing, for which he had to go to Johannesburg. One of the settlers was Prigji Karamdabhi Desai, who had never been accustomed to discomfort in all his life, but who had here to put up with bitter cold, a hot sun, and sharp rains. In the beginning we lived in tents for about 2 months while the buildings were under construction. The structures were all of corrugated iron and therefore did not take long to raise. The timber, too, could be had ready-made in all sizes required. All we had to do was cut it to measure. There were not many doors or windows to be prepared. Hence, there was quite a number of buildings that could be erected within such a short space of time. But all this labor was a heavy tax on Praji's physical constitution. The work on the farm was certainly harder than in jail. One day Praji actually fainted due to fatigue and heat. But he was not the man to give in. He fully trained up his body here, and in the end he stood abreast as a good worker with the best of us. Then there was Joseph Rogipen, a barrister free from a barrister's pride. He could not undertake very hard work. It was difficult for him to take down loads from the railway trains and to haul them on the cart, but he did it as best he could. The weak became strong on Tolstoy farm, and labor proved to be a tonic for all. Everyone had to go to Johannesburg on some errand or another. Children would like to go there just for the fun of it. I also had to go there on business. We therefore made a rule that one could go there by rail only on the public business of our little commonwealth, and then to travel third class. Anyone who wanted to go on a pleasure trip must go on foot and carry homemade provisions with him. None must spend anything on his food in the city. Had it not been for these drastic rules, the money saved by living in a rural locality would have been wasted on railway fares and city picnics. The provisions carried were of the simplest: home-baked bread from the coarse wheat flour ground at home, from which the bran was not removed, ground nut butter, also prepared at home, and homemade marmalade. We had purchased an iron hand mill for grinding wheat. Ground nut butter was made by roasting and then grinding ground nuts, and was 4 times cheaper than ordinary butter. As for the oranges, we had plenty of them. We scarcely used cow's milk on the farm, and generally managed with condensed milk. But to return to the trips. Anyone who wished to go to Johannesburg went there on foot once or twice a week, and returned the same day. As I've already stated, it was a journey of 21 miles and back. We saved hundreds of rupees by this one rule of going on foot, and those who thus went walking were much benefited. Some newly acquired the habit of walking. The general practice was that the sojourner should rise at 2 o'clock and start at 2:30. He would reach Johannesburg in 6 to 7 hours. The record for a minimum time taken on the journey was 4 hours and 18 minutes. The reader must not imagine that this discipline operated upon the settlers at all as a hardship. On the other hand, it was accepted cheerfully. It would have been impossible to have a single settler if force had been employed. The youngsters thoroughly enjoyed the work on the farm and the errands to the city. It was difficult to prevent them from playing their pranks while engaging in their work. No more work was given to them than they willingly and cheerfully rendered, and I never found that the work was thus done unsatisfactorily, either in quality or quantity. A paragraph may be devoted to our sanitary arrangements. In spite of the large number of settlers, one could not find refuse or dirt anywhere on the farm. All rubbish was buried in trenches sunk for the purpose. No water was permitted to be thrown on the roads. All wastewater was collected in buckets and used to water the trees. Leavings of food and vegetables refuse were utilized as manure. A square pit 1.5 feet deep was sunk near the house to receive the night soil, which was fully covered with an evacuated earth, which therefore did not give out any smell. There were no flies, and no one would imagine that night soil would be buried there. We were thus not only spared a nuisance, but the source of possible nuisance was converted into invaluable manure for the farm. If night soil were properly utilized, we would get manures worth lakhs of rupees and also secure immunity from a number of diseases. By our bad habits, we spoil our sacred riverbanks and furnish excellent breeding grounds for flies, with the result that the very flies which, through our criminal negligence, settle upon uncovered night soil, defy our bodies after we have bathed. A small spade is the means of salvation from a great nuisance. Leaving night soil, cleaning the nose, or spitting on the ground is a sin against God as well as humanity, and betrays a sad want of consideration for others. The man who does not cover his waist deserves a heavy penalty, even if he lives in the forest. The work before us was to make the farm a busy hive of industry, thus to save money, and in the end, to make the families self-supporting. If we achieved this goal, we could battle with the Transvaal government for an indefinite period. We had to spend some money on shoes. The use of shoes in a hot climate is harmful, as well as the perspiration that is absorbed by the feet, which thus have grown tender. No socks were needed in the Transvaal as in India, and we thought that the feet must be protected against thorn stones and the like. We therefore determined to make sandals. There is at Marion Hill, near Pinetown, a monastery of German Catholic monks called the Trappists, where industries of this nature are carried on. Mr. Kallenbach went there and acquired the art of making sandals. After he returned, he taught it to me, and I, in my turn, to other workers. Thus several young men learnt how to manufacture sandals, and we commenced selling them to friends. I need scarcely say that many of my pupils easily surpassed me in the art. Another handicraft introduced was that of carpentry. Having founded a sort of village, we needed all manner of things large and small, from benches to boxes, and we made them all ourselves. The selfless carpenters already referred to helped us for several months. Mr. Kallenbach was the head of the carpentry department, and as such every moment gave us the evidence of his mastery and exactitude. A school was indispensable for the youngsters and the children. This was the most difficult of our tasks, and we never achieved complete success in this manner till the very last. The burden of teaching work was largely borne by Mr. Kallenbach and myself. The school could be held only in the afternoon, when both of us were thoroughly exhausted by our morning labor, and so were the pupils. The teachers therefore would often be dozing as well as the taught. We would sprinkle water on the eyes, and by playing with the children we tried to pull them up and pull ourselves up, but sometimes in vain. The body peremptorily demanded rest and would not take a denial. But this was only one and the least of our many difficulties, for the classes were conducted in spite of these dozings. What were we to teach pupils who spoke 3 languages, Gujarati, Tamil, or Telugu, or how? I was anxious to make the vernaculars the medium of instruction. I knew a little Tamil but no Telugu. What could one teacher do in these circumstances? I tried to use some of the young men as teachers, but the experiment was not quite a success. Prague's services were requisitioned, of course. Some of the youngsters were very lazy and mischievous, and were always on bad terms with their books. A teacher could not expect to make such much headway with such pupils. Again, we could not be regular in our teaching. Business sometimes took Mr. Kallenbach as well as me to Johannesburg. Religious teaching presented another tough problem. I would like Mussulmans to read the Koran and Parsis the Avesta. There was one Koji child whose father had lain upon me the responsibility of teaching him a small poti of that sect. I collected books bearing on Islam and Zoroastrianism. I wrote out the fundamental doctrines of Hinduism according to my lights. I forget now whether it was for my children or for the Tolstoy farms. If this document was now in my possession, I should have inserted it here as a landmark in my spiritual progress. But I have thrown it away or burnt many such things in my life. I destroyed such papers as I felt it was not necessary to preserve them, or as the scope of my activities was extended. I am not sorry for this. So as to have preserved them all would have been burdensome and expensive to me. I should have been compelled to keep cabinets and boxes, which would have been an eyesore to one who has taken the vow of poverty. But this teaching experiment was not fruitless. The children were saved from the infection of intolerance, and learnt to view one another's religions and customs with a large-hearted charity. They learnt how to live together like blood brothers. They imbibed the lesson of mutual service, courtesy, and industry. And from what little I know about the later activities of some of the children on Tolstoy Farm, I am certain that the education they received there has not been in vain. Even if imperfect, it was a thoughtful and religious experiment, and among the sweetest reminiscences of Tolstoy Farm, the reminiscences of this teaching experience were no less sweet than the rest. But another chapter must be devoted to these reminiscences. Tolstoy Farm B by M. K. Gandhi. In this chapter, I propose to string together a number of Tolstoy farm reminiscences, which are rather disjointed and from which I therefore must crave the reader's indulgence. The teacher hardly ever had to teach the kind of heterogeneous class that fell to my lot, containing as it did pupils of all ages and both sexes, from boys and girls of about 7 years of age to young men of 20 and young girls of 12 or 13 years old. Some of the boys were wild and mischievous. What was I to teach this ill-assorted group? How was I to be all things to all pupils? Again, in what language should I talk to all of them? The Tamil and Telugu children knew their own mother tongue or English, and a little Dutch. I could speak to them only in English. I divided the class into two sections. The Gujarati section talked to in Gujarati and the rest in English. As the principal part of my teachings, I arranged to tell or read to them some interesting stories. I also proposed to bring them into close mutual contact and to lead them to cultivate a spirit of friendship and service. Then there was to be imparted some general knowledge of history and geography, and in some cases arithmetic. Writing was also taught, and so were some which formed part of our prayers, and to which therefore I tried to attract the Tamil children as well. The boys and girls met freely. My experiment of coeducation and Tolstoy farm was the most fearless of its type. I dare not today allow or train children to enjoy the liberty which I granted the Tolstoy farm class. I have often felt that my mind then used to be more innocent than it is now, and that was due perhaps to my ignorance. Since then I have had bitter experiences, and have sometimes burnt my fingers badly. Persons whom I took to be thoroughly innocent have turned out to be corrupt. I have observed the roots of evil down deep in my own nature, and timidly have claimed me for its own. I do not repent having made this experiment. My conscience bears witness that it did not do any harm. But as a child who has burnt himself with hot milk blows even into whey, my present attitude is one of extra caution. A man cannot borrow faith or courage from others. The doubter is marked out for destruction, as the Gita puts it. My faith and courage were at their highest at the Tolstoy farm. I have been praying to God to permit me to re-attain that height, but the prayer has not yet been heard, for the number of such supplicants before the great white throne is legion. The only consolation is that God has as many ears as there are supplicants. I therefore repose full faith in him, and know that my prayer will be accepted when I have fitted myself for such grace. This was my experiment. I sent the boys reputed to be mischievous, and the innocent young girls to bathe in the same spot at the same time. I had fully explained the duty of self-restraint to the children, who were all familiar with my Satyagraha doctrine. I knew, and so did the children, that I loved them with a mother's love. The reader will remember the spring at some distance from the kitchen. Was it folly to let the children meet there and bathe, and yet expect them to be innocent? My eye always followed the girls as a mother's eye would follow a daughter. The time was fixed when all the boys and girls went together for a bath. There was an element of safety in the fact that they went in a body. Solitude was always avoided. Generally, I also would be at the spring at the same time. All of us slept on an open veranda. The boys and girls would spread themselves around me. There was hardly a distance of 3 feet between any two beds. Some care was exercised in arranging the order of the beds, but any amount of such care would have been futile in the case of a wicked mind. I now see that God alone safeguarded the honor of those boys and girls. I made the experiment from a belief that boys and girls could thus live together without harm, and the parents, with their boundless faith in me, allowed me to make it. One day one of the young men made fun of 2 girls, and the girls themselves or some child brought me the information. The news made me feel terrible. I made inquiries and found out that the report was true. I remonstrated with the young man, but that was not enough. I wished the 2 girls to have some sign on their person as a warning to every young man that no evil eye may be cast upon them, and as a lesson to every girl that no one dare assail their purity. The passionate Ravana could not so much as touch Sita with evil intent, while Rama was thousands of miles away. What mark should the girls bear so as to give them a sense of security and at the same time to sterilize the sinner's eyes? This question kept me awake for a night. In the morning, I gently suggested to the girls that they might let me cut off their fine long hair. On the farm we shaved and cut the hair of one another, and we therefore kept scissors and clipping machines. At first the girls would not listen to me. I had already explained the situation to the elderly woman, who could not bear to think of my suggestion, but yet quite understood my motive, and they had finally accorded their support to me. They were both of them noble girls. One of them is, alas, no more. She was very bright and intelligent. The other is living and the mistress of a household of her own. They came round, after all, and at once the very hand that is narrating this incident set to cut off their hair. And afterwards I analyzed and explained my procedure before the class with excellent results. I never heard of a joke again. The girls in question did not lose in any case. Goodness knows how much they gained. I hope the young men still remember this incident and keep their eyes from sin. Experiments such as I have placed on record are not meant for imitation. Any teacher who imitates them would be thus incurring grave risk. I have here taken note of them only to show how far a man can go in certain circumstances and to stress the purity of the Satyagraha struggle. This very purity was a guarantee of its victory. Before launching on such an experiment, a teacher has to be both father and mother to his pupils and to be prepared for all eventualities, whatever, and only the hardest penance can fit him to conduct them. This act of mine was not without its effect on the entire life of the settlers on the farm. As we had intended to cut down expenses to the barest minimum, we changed our dress also. In the city, the Indian men, including the Satyagrahis, put on a European dress. Such elaborate clothing was not needed on the farm. We had all become laborers and therefore put on laborers' dress, but in the European style, viz., workmen's trousers and shirts, which were imitated from prisoners' uniforms. We all used cheap trousers and shirts, which could be hand ready-made out of coarse blue cloth. Most of the ladies were good hands at sewing and took charge of the tailoring department. As for food, we generally had rice, dal, vegetables, and roti, with porridge, occasionally soup added. All of this was served in a single dish, which was not really a dish but a kind of bowl such as supplied to prisoners in jail. We had made wooden spoons on the farms ourselves. There were 3 meals a day. We had bread and homemade wheaten coffee at 6 in the morning, rice, dal, and vegetables at 11, and wheat pap and milk or bread and coffee at 5:30 in the evening. After the evening meal, we had prayers at 7 or 8:30. At prayers, we sang bhajans and sometimes had readings from the Ramayana or books on Islam. The bhajans were in English, Hindu, and Gujarati. Sometimes we had one bhajan from each of the 3 languages, and sometimes only one. Everyone retired at 9 o'clock. Many observed the Ekdashi fast on the farm. We were joined there by Sir P. K. Kotwal, who had much experience of fasting, and some of us followed him to keep the Chaturmas. Ramzan also arrived in the meanwhile. There were Muslim youngsters among us, and we felt we must encourage them to keep the fasts. We arranged for them to have meals in the evening as well as in the early morning. Porridge, etc., was prepared for them in the evening. There was no meat, of course, nor did anyone ask for it. To keep the Muslims' friends company, the rest of us had only 1 meal a day in the evening. As a rule, we finished our evening meal before sunset, so the only difference was that the others finished their supper about when Muslim boys commenced theirs. These boys were so courteous that they did not put anyone to extra trouble, although they were observing their fasts. And the fact that the non-Muslim children supported them in the manner of fasting left a good impression on all. I do not remember that there was ever a quarrel, much less a split, between the Hindu and the Muslim boys on the score of religion. On the other hand, I know that although staunch in their own beliefs, they all treated one another with respect and assisted one another in their respective religious observances. Although we were living far from the amenities of city life, we did not keep even the commonest appliances against the possible attack of illness. I had in those days as much faith in the nature cure of disease as I had in the innocence of children. I felt that there should not be disease as we lived a simple life, and if there was, I was confident of dealing with it. My booklet on health is a notebook of my experiments and of my living faith in those days. I was proud enough to believe that illness for me was out of the question. I held that all kinds of disease could be cured by earth and water treatment, fasting, or changes in diet. There was not a single case of illness on the farm in which we used drugs or called in a doctor. There was an old man from North India, 70 years of age, who suffered from asthma cough, but whom I cured simply by changes in diet and water treatment. But I have now lost the courage, and, in view of my two serious illnesses, I feel I have forfeited even the right to make such experiments. Tolstoy Farm proved to be a center of spiritual purification and penance for the final campaign. I have serious doubts as to whether the struggle could have been prosecuted for 8 years, whether we could have secured larger funds, and whether the thousands of men who participated in the last phase of the struggle would have borne their share of it if there had been no Tolstoy Farm. Tolstoy Farm was never placed in the limelight, yet an institution which deserved it attracted public sympathy to itself. The Indians saw that the Tolstoy farmers would do what they were doing and what they themselves were not prepared to do, and what they looked upon in the light of hardship. The public confidence was a great asset to the movement when it was organized afresh on a large scale in 1913. One can never tell whether such assets give an account of themselves, and if yes, when. But I do not entertain, or would ask the reader not to entertain, a shadow of a doubt that such latent assets do, in God's good time, become patent.